that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. It's such a pleasure to be actually physically in the gallery, surrounded by this work on the occasion of the opening of this mammoth project, Le Grand Abyss, which is a new exhibition by Stephen Brands. So I'm going to start by briefly introducing Stephen and offering some kind of framing thoughts on the work before we have our conversation, and there's going to be plenty of time for questions from the audience as well. So Stephen was born in Wolverhampton. He's been living in Ireland for 30 years, and his practice encompasses monumental drawing, collage, painting, printed projects, signage, and moving image work. And his work addresses the legacy of the European Enlightenment through the medium of narrative and storytelling, both visual and through text. And he looks at it with this very particular, askance, oblique viewpoint, again informed by the European traditions of satire and absurdism. In 2005, he represented Ireland at the Venice Biennale, and he continues to work and to exhibit nationally and internationally very widely. And so this exhibition today is it's an expansion and a continuation of Le Place du Grand Abyss that opened in the Centre Culturel Irlandais in October of 2020, and it's the culmination of more than 10 years now of research and work across various disciplines. And so when you enter the gallery, you are met by this monumental 10-foot high drawing, maybe even more. And it's punctuated by these monumental drawings that collage recognizable images of architectural fragments with strange, disjunctive details of animals or figures from different historical moments. And at the heart of this exhibition, then, is this hour-long moving image work, which is based on the format of an animated slideshow. And it follows the adventures, or maybe more precisely, the misadventures of Albert Sitzfleisch. And we follow him through his journeys from Kinsale, where he is writing a book on optimism, to Paris, and then to Athens, and then to Strasbourg. But as well as journeying through, geographically through place, we're also brought on this journey through time. So at various points you overhear this quite vicious war of words between the ghost of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Voltaire. At another moment, we follow the ghost of Sitzfleisch through the ruins of the Place de Vosges, the future Paris of 2169. And so even though this is set in kind of like a future, it's a kind of quite dystopian future of 2069, each vignette, each chapter is cited in a particular European city that has an intimate connection with the democratic project or the Enlightenment project. But we meet each of them at some particular moment of catastrophe or impending violence, it seems like. So at one particular point, Sitzfleisch is watching smoke rising over the streets of Paris as he stands on the hill in the Bellevue Park. At another moment, he's watching tanks roll through the streets of Athens and fighter planes flying overhead. Even when he's on his holidays in this beautiful little town in Crete, his peace is disturbed by the suspicious deaths of two people who were sharing a neighbouring apartment. But through it all, he's unperturbed, and he continues his, peregrinations in a kind of upbeat fashion. So even though this project is more than 10 years in its research, it's incredibly prescient at this particular moment when we're so beset by chaos and impending catastrophe on so many fronts. And so it offers a huge amount of ideas to think about. And I suppose I'd start by asking quite a broad question about the importance of travel to your work, both as a research method and also as a narrative device.
Yeah, I think where we live on the very edge of Europe is an interesting place to be. I've been here 30 years. So taking a keen interest in things that are happening in Europe, it's almost like watching it from another room. So therefore the need to go and travel to actually absorb what's happening in Europe is incredibly important, and quite possibly, because I'm often there for very short moments of time, I can only take in so much information. I probably get a lot of things wrong, but in getting those things wrong, I think it provides interesting material for the work. A lot of the work in terms of facts and historical truths are often askant, are quite blatantly wrong. And I think in picking points up, as most tourists do, bits of information, when you bring it back and think about it, it's quite often comes out in a very strange order. And in terms of bringing back material through photographs, through stories, through magazines that I might buy in second-hand shops, I then cut it up and then put it back together again. And what's happening is in the work is there's a very strange dichotomy between the things that I'm interested in, whether it's political philosophy or history, and the actual business of just making art. Mm-hmm. I'm not an academic, and I don't want to approach the work academically. It's experimental. I want it to be experimental. I don't know what's going to happen until I start messing around with it.
And so the travelogue as a literary device is a really interesting way of working then, isn't it? Because it's so idiosyncratic, it's so personal, even though it has this kind of factual names and dates and things like that. You never know whether your narrator is
That's it. It's a device.
Yeah.
It's something we've all experienced. It's common to all of us, and it kind of goes back to having to sit through the parents' slideshows when they've been on a holiday or came back from holiday. A lot of it was really banal. Other bits were really interesting for the wrong reasons, and I think using the slideshow as a format for creating something that has a slightly more dubious narrative element. It plays with that aesthetic, even though it's in black and white, most of it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting format. It allows you a lot of license. And another device that you use, I think, which is really interesting, is this character that we, follow on this journey. You started off, in your project thinking about travel in about 2004, was it, with this project Ways of Escape, which drew on a family narrative.
It was kind of based on a family narrative. I mean, I'd gone to Romania to follow a journey that my grandmother, who I'd never met, did back to the UK in 1913. But I knew right from the start that I wasn't going to illustrate that. It was an interesting journey, but I didn't take photographs, but I made notes of things just on postcard size pieces of paper, drawings. And then once I brought that back, I started to make much larger scenarios on vinyl that use those little bits and pieces, reordered them, I suppose, to make topographies or landscapes.
Mm-hmm. And so the character now that you have been using for the last 10 years, Sitzfleisch, what was the purpose of kind of this fictional character for you? What does he allow you to do?
he allowed me to project ideas that weren't necessarily my own. I think as an artist, I think it's important not to throw in your own opinions about something. It's quite nice to think about other people's opinions about situations and about the political state of things, or even the taste of something through somebody else's eyes and senses. So again, it was a device to do that. I think when things come from the heart, people read you as a person in a particular way, whereas if you can deflect that onto an invented character, there's a lot more license there to do anything you want.
And so
It's as simple as that.
collage becomes it's a really important process for you, isn't it? Like both as a kind of formal method, and I always think of collage as it's always been a very radical art form, and there's something quite anarchic and disruptive about it, because it's as much about tearing as it is about piecing things together.
Absolutely.
And very much against kind of like 2 fingers up to the kind of idea of the proper or the orderly. But as well as being a formal process for you, it's also kind of a conceptual process. You've talked about using history as material for collage.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
When you're tearing Paris Match magazines from one in from 1948 and another from 1964, you've got 2 different. There's a little collage downstairs of just 2 images placed side by side. One taken during the war, I think, as a Russian soldier that got captured by the Germans with his hands up, and then next to that, they're sharing arms, is an image from 1964's Paris Match of a minstrel's advert. And she's got nice clean hands, and it's thought the juncture, putting the 2 together is actually, it's funny, but it's actually quite hard. You're laughing at something that's not funny.
Yeah.
That sort of humour appeals to me.
Yeah. And that particular humour, that particular very, very black, satirical humour, which I always really, really enjoy in your work, is it's also related to that particular kind of anarchic drive, isn't it? I mean, satire and absurdism have always had a kind of political impetus. Again, they're a way of puncturing this idea of the proper and the orderly. But it also functions to make these quite bleak topics kind of more approachable.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that we've got a background sound of middle of the road rock music going on while we're talking about this. I suppose I'm always interested in the way that how people deal with tragedy or deal with fear and loathing. Humour is one way of dealing with it, I guess.
And I suppose it kind of when you're talking about using the way in which you use narrative to again create these fictions, these kind of parallel dystopian fictions. Humour is a way of, again, another way of drawing an audience into this particular world that you've created, isn't it? It's very disarming.
Yeah, it's interesting that even across Europe, a certain kind of humour is from the north of England or Scotland and Ireland, Northern Ireland, even Denmark, Poland.
Yeah.
There's a certain sense of humour that we all share, and it's all dark, It's I think for cultures that have suffered some way, there's a commonality there.
This particular gallows humour.
Yeah. It's common to us all. It's nice that we have something we share.
Exactly. And as kind of one of the ways in which you kind of use or inject humour into your work, sometimes anyways, the way in which you use animals, because animals crop up in your work quite a lot. Obviously we see birds of different kinds, as the owl and the ibis, and very memorably there's the dodo appears in the film, but not as a character, as a menu item, which I really enjoyed. So can you talk about what animals do?
Yeah, I know animals have always had their had symbolism attached to them, and yeah, I'm familiar with that. But I think I started using animals because I had a problem with using humans, or I was unable to find a way of bringing a human element into the work that I was happy with, that wasn't purely caricature. So, you know, what do children's writers do to avoid the problem of race, or they use animals as a common denominator that the children can see personal characteristics in.
Yes.
So each of those, the animals that I use, I mean, the owl crops up all the time, but every time I started doing a drawing of the owl, it would remind me of some historical figure, like Napoleon. You know what? One of the drawings looks like that, the way Napoleon is portrayed in paintings, or the painting downstairs. The owl started to, while I was making it, started to look like the philosopher Martin Heidegger. And I don't know why, probably because I'd been researching these characters and looking at the photographs of them, those characteristics started appearing. So no longer are they just owls, they're starting to take on human characteristics, and often quite adversely to the context they're portrayed in.
And so does the dodo have a particular significance?
The dodo came from the last project I did in Edinburgh, where the exhibition was situated in the University of Edinburgh. The room that I'd made a drawing of a dodo appeared in was the room that Darwin used as a study for a certain amount of time. But also the National Museum of Scotland is only next door, and they've got this fantastic model of a dodo. So, you know, if anybody's doing their cultural trip around Edinburgh, they'll see the dodo in the National Museum, and then they saw it in the exhibition. But obviously, the dodo in my exhibition was taken completely out of context and used rather cruelly.
Which seems to be kind of a continuation of the poor dodo's history, anyway.
Yeah, the dodo appears as a farmed product in the video here, but the fact that the dodo's DNA is actually being kept in the University of Leiden with the potential that it could be crossed with a pigeon and recreated again. That's just a little side story of the main. But you know, it's interesting how we keep trying to recreate historical moments, and the dodo is a historical moment that could potentially be remade again. To
what end? For a sandwich filling, you're thinking, in Paris in the future? It's quite bleak.
What kicked off that was there is in the Jardin des Plantes in Paris. There's a little hut that is called Dodo menagerie. There's a children's animal park, the Dodo menagerie. So I only just removed a couple of the letters from with Photoshop, and it became Dodo manger.
Yeah, it's those kind of things, that particular kind of mixture of the fantastical and the familiar, like the dodo, but also in this like monumental drawing behind us here in the Place des Vosges, where you have these like disparate fantastical architectural fragments, like these ruins of Greek columns, or this obelisk, or this disembodied head that you were saying is related to a picture that you saw of Stalin's nurse. This kind of mixture of the fantastical and the familiar. It reminds me of the surrealist writer Louis Aragon, and the way in which he described the marvelous is this eruption of the irrational into the real.
Yeah, into the everyday.
Yeah.
And it goes back to Russian writers like Gogol as well.
Yeah.
And even Flann O'Brien.
Yeah. Absolutely.
He's one of the reasons I'm here in Ireland. I think I read The Third Policeman. I thought I'll have to go there. On that stage.
And so you see yourself as working within this kind of surrealist tradition, do you, or?
Yeah, well, I had this conversation about pantomime. The difference between realism and pantomime is promoting ideas. And historically, pantomime has been an accessible way of getting really difficult ideas across in a way that's a bit more playful than realism.
Yeah, but you're slightly disarmed, aren't you? You kind of think this is an entertainment, and it's a way of, as you say, kind of dealing with very difficult, often quite violent or traumatic subjects.
Yeah, again, you're put in that position where you're laughing at things you possibly shouldn't be laughing at.
Absolutely.
So you question the reason why you're laughing at it.
Yeah.
Therefore, you question the subject then as well.
And so it's a useful kind of political device, or anarchic device, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you subject to your anarchic humour these various historical personages. So at various points we meet these people from history. So we, witness a very vicious.
What surprises me about these the historical characters that I choose to put into work is that quite often they've had a profound effect on history or historical thinking, but when you look at their real lives, their own behaviour quite often contradicts the influence that they've had on history. I mean, Rousseau, an unbelievable character, profound effect on political thinking, but he himself was a mess, an utter narcissist. While he promoted the idea of the nation state having being tied to a social contract, he himself found it very difficult to make friends with anybody.
Wow.
So,
and he carries that kind of.
which is hugely ironic.
Yeah.
And in the video, almost like a playground fight between the two ghosts. Voltaire, who I'm sure would be like one of the founding fathers of neoliberalism in his outlook to life, and then Rousseau would be the polar opposite, are interred side by side in the basement of the Pantheon. So I just imagine what would happen if the two ghosts actually appeared from actually Rousseau, this goes into here, Rousseau isn't even buried there. It's a long story, it's in there.
And it's very interesting the way you introduce these different narratives and very different tones in each chapter. So it progresses across 12 different vignettes or chapters, and in another chapter we hear about this amazing Greek feminist historical figure, Kelleher, Perret, and she was an incredible figure that I hadn't heard about before. That was again a really interesting moment that you kind of explore.
Yeah, I can't remember how I came across her first of all. I think it was from just going down a Google wormhole, but it just how serendipity comes across from Athens. The family, we went to Crete, and in the closest town to where we were staying is where she was from. That she was the proto-feminist networks were cropping up throughout Europe. She was connected to Patrick Geddes somehow.
Oh, right, okay.
Through the Abercrombies, who were the, I think, Director Generals of Dublin at the time. It's so, the way the aristocracy is interconnected through the late 19th century, 19th century is quite phenomenal. There would have been a connection there with him setting up kind of feminist movements amongst, ladies of a certain class, of course.
Of course, yeah.
That kicked off the suffragette movement.
And so we don't meet her as a ghost in Berlin, like we meet Rousseau and Voltaire as ghosts, but it's really interesting the way that ghosts crop up again as another kind of device throughout this, because as well as these historical personages, at one particular point you also visit the ghost or the trace of a street, this Rue Vaughan in Paris, which is someplace that the French writer Georges Perret talks about in great detail, and that's a really interesting a story that you explore as well.
The first time I read it, I got this book of Georges Perret's collected writings 25 years ago, and I dipped in and out of it. There was one particular piece of writing called Rue Vaughan. That when I read it at face value, I thought it was just a piece of modernist writing. No description, just detailing what was there very formally. I thought, it's making the point. But it was only a few years later that I found out that it was the street that he'd actually lived in up until the age of 4. And during the war, he'd been evacuated from Paris, being Jewish, to go and live with relatives down the country. But when he returned, of course, all the occupants of the street had been taken away by the Gestapo. So he'd avoided that street for a long, long time until he'd been walking through Belleville, that's the area where the street is, and went back to visit it. Then he realised that the street was being emptied because it was going to be, it had been designated during the 1930s as unhygienic, and therefore the Council of Paris had already decided to build a park there instead. So what Georges Perret did was went back every 6 months to detail the erasure of this street. So when I went to look at it on Google Maps, all I could find was 2 brand new not brand new anymore, but 1960s, 1970s apartments, and then nothing, just the gates to Bellevue Park. And I really wanted to make something of that, just to take it a step further and document the flowers that were in the park there. So I kind of made notes of what was there with my very uneducated knowledge of plant varieties.
But you list them in this very...
But that's something Georges Perret would have done himself.
Yeah.
But then you think about, maybe it's a good thing if you take away an unhygienic area of a city and then replace it with nature. Mm-hmm. But then the social aspect of it is...
Where do the people go?
Where do the people go? Yeah. And of course, it wasn't a Jewish ghetto by that stage. There would have been a few Jewish families left, but then a lot of North Africans who would have then have been moved out to the banlieue. Mm-hmm. I don't want to answer any questions because I'm ill-equipped to answer answer questions, but bringing them up,
it's a really
quite often things I don't know how to answer or want to make work about.
Even pointing to them and leaving that space around them for different kind of readings or different kind of interpretations is really interesting. And again, pointing to this, just to the complexity and the fraught nature of recent history and all these kind of improving projects, and maybe the kind of the flip side of their promise or the failure of those promises, which is really interesting.
I mean, the street itself was iconic. It had been used. There's some steps that lead up from Rue Valin up to the area above that had appeared in something like 12 films.
Wow.
They were that iconic.
That's so interesting.
Quite famous directors.
So it lives on in a kind of a ghostly form and different. Yeah. That's really interesting.
And they're not there anymore, of course.
Yeah. And one of the things that we spoke about when we were chatting in preparation for this was this idea of conflict, because conflict is something that appears throughout this work. We see...
it's a device.
Yes, absolutely.
Again.
Yeah.
And that's something that interests me, that, in times of relative peace and civility, how people go seeking conflict just because they can't cope with the boredom of civility.
We need the drama.
As a device to use in making art, put two things that conflict with each other together, something interesting happens. There's a chemistry that happens. Just using two different images from different magazines and putting them together. They both have different messages. One's about advertising, one's about horrors of war. There's an electric charge that comes out of that. And it's the same using figurative imagery and then placing it next to something that's completely abstract. And I go looking for that dynamic or that kind of electric charge to happen between those images. Sometimes it happens within one painting.
Yes.
Sometimes it doesn't. I think when putting an exhibition together as well, I'm very conscious about how those dynamics work or don't work. Some images might be of a certain caliber, and then I'll put something that really shouldn't be there just because it's like putting a punctuation mark in the wrong place. It just throws a sentence out of...
it changes the sense of everything.
It changes the sense of everything.
Because there's something, there's an incredible kind of intricacy to your work, an incredibly fine detail in your drawings, for example, and in the really seamless finish of your collages. But when we were talking about the way in which you put together the animated slideshow, that was a deliberately quite lo-fi technique, and you were talking about the kind of again, that becomes quite there's kind of a punk sensibility to that as well, of using something quite lo-fi, deliberately lo-fi, because you're particular.
I think we're bombarded with images all the time, and the images we're bombarded by are as a result of the technology that creates them. So at the moment, we're looking at advertising and films, really high quality CGI.
Yes.
So I purposely, when I was looking for film editing or moving image editing software, I went looking for the clumsiest I could possibly find, because I personally value the time that goes into putting it together, more so than the quality of what the finished thing looks like, because that disjointedness, it speaks in a different way to high quality imagery that we see today.
And it offers a very particular aesthetic then, doesn't it? It has a texture, this kind of...
Yeah, it's kind of closer to either silent movies of the 1920s and 30s, or even something like Chris Markham, the Jeté,
Yes, yeah.
which was composed of singular images. It's just a completely different way of being fed images.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, like, this isn't a silent film. There's a really like compelling soundscape that you develop around that as well, which is really interesting. And we were talking about that just before this conversation started. Do you want to talk a little bit about where the sound came from and how that works in your process?
Most of the soundtrack, I've used Eric Satie's music for a surrealist film called, I forgot what it's called now, Untrustworthy, that was used. It was a film that was made by Rennie Clare and then went on to be a very successful Hollywood director and very middle-of-the-road director. But one of his first films was quite surrealist, almost a cross between Benny Hill in some respects. You know, there's a chase of a coffin through the streets that loses its reins and then travels off through Paris on its own accord with a whole parade of people chasing after it. And this is the soundtrack to this. So Eric Satie and Francis Gabi, who was also a prominent surrealist painter, this is the soundtrack. So it was a comedic film soundtrack, but I've slowed it down and sped it up according to the nature of what's going on in each of the chapters. So there's the second to last chapter, I've slowed it down to a tenth of its speed, and it's incredibly sad.
Desperately sad, yeah, absolutely. And there's other moments then where you seem to be using some kind of, it sounds like a Greek traditional music, which is also slowed down, kind of warped, and like it creates a very affective atmosphere. That's really interesting. But you were also speaking about the way in which sound almost acts like a scaffold for you to structure the slideshow around, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to make something first and then find the right music for it. Okay. So right at the beginning of the project, I was looking for the music that would be the soundtrack. And obviously, what's more limiting is looking for royalty-free music that didn't have to contravene copyright. I mean, in the past, where I've used music that's been made by existing musicians or bands, I've gone for their permission, and I've often used that. But in this case, Eric Satie's been dead for years. You'd have to deal with corporate.
It's very expensive, and
And I think in a case like this, it's just you're allowed to credit them.
I think he'd be in sympathy with your project anyway, maybe with your methods.
Corporations have no sympathy for anything.
What's very interesting about this project as a whole is the way in which it dwells on specific places and specific individuals that are associated with periods of enlightenment, with great promise, with great ambition for the improvement of the human race, the improvement of life for a certain class of people, if not the majority of people. But we meet them in states of collapse, or we meet them in states of where that promise has been, is threatened or is desperately unfulfilled.
It's not totally hopeless either.
Yes, yeah.
There are moments of optimism.
Yeah.
I've actually made a piece recently. I won't go into this, but the piece is called "It's Not All Misery." I think it's that whole idea of humour getting us out of that, but. People's lives are a patchwork of misery and happiness. So it's, maybe I do dwell on the misery, but hopefully in a slightly comedic way. It's.
Because as we meet at the start, Sitzfleisch is writing a book on optimism. So I was wondering, would you consider yourself an optimist?
No.
Okay.
No, all the time.
Yeah.
I'm not a complete pessimist either. And, it helps to look on the dark side, because you're disappointed less.
Yes, yeah, that makes sense. And with that gallows humour, I think, which makes everything so easier. I've been talking for a long time. I wonder if we'd like to open it up now to questions from the audience, if there's anybody who'd have any questions for Stephen. Hi, Maud.
I've been reading some of Susan Howe. She's an American poet. I've been reading some of her books. And she has this sort of ability to do some historical research. You like the structure of her narratives, actually, because she uses these very deep research about historical narratives. And then she breaks into, because she's a poet, she breaks into very rough ground of very abstract poetry, as well as reminiscences, as well as documentary observations and sequences of history. I like that kind of mix, it's very good. But she makes a point that because she brings things from the past into the present, into the mind of the present, that she is actually, they become present. And I wanted to ask you about that kind of great sweep of your endeavour, and how you use different scales and structures. Do you like the kind of aesthetic mediation of your ambition? That within that, have you changed your understanding of time? I mean, because it's a very strange sort of thing. We've all felt the distortions in time during the lockdown. Certainly we're facing into wonderful, with the deepest respect, kind of strange times of disruption. Things are being done we never thought would be done, like this, like in tourism, we're rushing towards herd immunity, in a kind of subliminal way. That things are changing. There's the turmoil of your work is actually a reality. But I wonder if your understanding of time and how these sequences play out in time has changed during your project. Sorry for such a long question.
This was all made before the pandemic, so it's funny looking back on it. I have to admit that I only got a little bit of what you're saying. Unfortunately, my hearing aids are picking up sound from. Well, yeah. Actually, I'm nervous when it
The question really is, given your excavation of all these matters of time and history and narrative and aesthetics, has your attitude to time changed as you were doing the project?
That's kind of a difficult question, because I approach a project knowing that it's going to take a certain amount of time, but it's not fixed in any way. That you have to allow for changes of mood and changes of ideas develop over that period of time. So quite often I'll look more critically at the beginning of a project and then decide whether I'm actually going to use it after towards the end of it. So I don't think of time in the same way. I just think of it as a production.
Have you kind of felt other realities of time that are not sequential?
I think that happens when you're making something that's a moving image that has a narrative, or if you're doing something that's of a narrative nature, either you can start from A and end with Z, or you can mix it around a bit. And in mixing it around a bit, it's like mixing grammar or syntax around, or making oxymorons out of time or chapters. It's like putting two different words together, like sports and personality. You know, you've got a really strange oxymoron there.
But I was also very thinking about, you know, you have sort of, as you say, the work is driven and expresses itself in art, but is a device to reach some other reality in some ways about the nature of humanity. And I just wonder, like, that tension between the abstraction and the narrative in your work.
Yeah, it's funny. I've often thought about creating narrative just using abstract means. And a lot of artists do that really successfully. You know, how you can create sort of human relationships, or almost seemingly human relationships out of abstract forms. Modernism's always tried to do that, but you know, yes, I think is the answer. I think I am really interested in that and try to do that, but it's interesting then when you put something that's completely abstract face to face with something that's completely narrative, and what happens there. You know, it's not while I pick up on or use a lot of language or styles that come from the interwar period of the last century. I don't mean to make pastiche of that or copy that. I use it wrongly for the right reasons, as opposed to the wrong reasons.
That's really interesting. And actually, as a follow-on to that, I just wanted to, again, your very particular approach to time in relation to this. So obviously this project is set in the future, in two potential futures. So 2069 and then 2169. But you have said previously that you do not consider this work science fiction. Speculative histories.
History.
Yeah, yeah.
And I always like what Margaret Atwood said, that she was interviewed a while ago, and she said, or the interviewer asked her, is what you're doing in any way kind of predictive? And she said, well, no. History can, or the future can go in any multitudes of directions. You know, it's infinite, but what Margaret Atwood says she's doing is she's just looking at one case scenario that we hope we don't ever reach.
The darkest time. Yeah.
I think most people who work with science fiction or speculative history do that. I mean, it's down to the human imagination and everything. But you know, the human imagination only works on what has gone before.
With its given materials, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there seem to be continuing repetitive narratives. They're all slightly different, but you know, there are similar patterns that keep repeating themselves. Not always bad, sometimes good.
Yeah. Do you think that's a way of inoculating ourselves against this kind of feeling of dread at particular moments when things seem quite chaotic? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Is there, sorry.
Yeah, it's vaccination against the misery by giving you a little bit more misery and making it a bit more ridiculous.
Emotional vaccination.
Ridiculous misery. It's probably a good time to.
Yeah.
I've just noticed my children malingering around.
So at that moment, so we have a little bit of quiet. Oh, sorry, yes.
Just a quick question. Could you say a bit about the typography and your use of French and kind of, I mean, in this room it seems kind of it locates in the past, but it's also got kind of an absurdist quality. I haven't seen the whole show, but there seems to be abundance of use of text and typography, and it's something that could be, just say a bit more about that.
Yeah.
It seems to dominate.
The project I did before this one was, you know, it it was commissioned by the University of Edinburgh Gallery. So the work paired Gdansk with Edinburgh. There's a lot of characters associated with those two cities. And Edinburgh, of course, in the 1700s was an absolute hotbed of Enlightenment thinking. But of course, so was Paris. Paris was imagining its own sense of political enlightenment on 500 BC Athens. So then that's why I used Athens and Paris as the places choice to work with.
Typography is particular,
Oh yeah, the typography I'm pulling from magazines directly, Paris Match, some anarchist newspapers that I managed to pick up from the 1940s. But this means excuse my pronunciation, but it means that the riot has been cancelled. Yeah, it's a case of misappropriation of existing stuff, just to see what comes out of it. Hoping it's funny, for the wrong right reasons.
Are there any last questions? Or
sorry to hold you up because I know that outside, but I'm interested in composition. How you approach composition seems to be in the same way that it's very spark of energy between the rock band and the high art conversation. Two images from magazines. It feels to me a beautiful balance between order and decay in your graphics, and the composition is a beautiful order. Normally, is how I experience it, and then there are elements of decay within that order. But I just wondered how you actually make that complete sense of order, particularly in your large works. What's the way you approach that?
Practice. It's that balance between having a sense of order and then, allowing that 3 months of time to improvise. So just a balance of both. And I guess, I look at compositions just as little drawings in terms of where things, the main skeleton of something's going to be, but allowing for that improvisation to carry on throughout the next however long 3 months it's going to take to finish the drawing.
thanks very much for that insight, Stephen. And thank you, everybody, for coming today. Thank you, Anne, for inviting us to be here. And Stephen, congratulations on the opening of this fantastic show.
You can all enjoy the Fleetwood Mac outside now.